Thank you, Madam President. I rise this morning to discuss the pending legislation that would prevent terrorists from being able to legally purchase guns. This general topic of background checks for the legal firearm sales is not new to me. It's an issue that I've been wrestling with for some years now, shortly after the horrific murders at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. My Democratic colleague, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, he and I teamed up and worked together and produced a bipartisan bill that was designed to ensure that we would do background checks for commercial gun sales, so that if someone wants to buy a firearm through a commercial mechanism, not a private transaction like from a sibling or a neighbor or a friend, but a commercial sale would be subject to a background check so that the very criminals who have forfeited their Second Amendment rights and those who are dangerously mentally ill, who also should not have guns, we would find a mechanism to prevent the sales. That was legislation that I worked on with Senator Manchin. As I said, it was bipartisan. It still marks the closest the U.S. Senate has come to passing legislation dealing with background checks in a meaningful way in quite some time, but we were not successful. It didn't pass. Then on June 12th, we saw the worst terror attack on American soil since 9/11. An unbelievable massacre in Orlando that left 49 people dead, another 53 grievously wounded. And it has raised the question of whether now there is an opportunity to do something to make it illegal, make it more difficult, if not impossible, for a terrorist who we already deem to be too dangerous to, say, board a plane, make it illegal for that person to buy a firearm. There's other things we need to be doing, by the way, a lot of other things we need to be doing to keep us safe from the terrorists who want to kill Americans. We need to take stronger measures to keep them from entering the U.S. in the first place. We ought to make sure they can't escape detention and capture, and we ought to make sure that local law enforcement are cooperating with federal law enforcement and DHS folks. There's a lot of things we can do, but one of the things we can do is the very simple measure that the Collins legislation addresses. This is too important an issue to be partisan. I took to the Senate floor last week to urge my colleagues. We had a number of our Democratic colleagues engaging in a filibuster and an impassioned series of speeches about how important it was that we do something. And my message was simply, let's stop talking and let's actually do it. Let's actually find the mechanism, find the solution here, because there's two aspects that we need to consider, in my view, in this legislation. One is we want to block a terrorist from buying a firearm. I don't think that should be terribly controversial. But the second thing that's also very important to me, and I think many of our colleagues, is to make sure that an innocent American who's wrongly put on the list has the opportunity to clear his or her name, so that their Second Amendment rights are not infringed upon. That's the challenge, it seems to me, and it's not rocket science. This is something that we can do. So I actually drafted a bill that does that. I think the bill works very, very well. Senator Collins took a different approach and used a different mechanism for getting the same result. In the end, Senator Collins has legislation now that has significant bipartisan support. It's a compromise bill that I think strikes the right balance. And as I announced yesterday, I intend to support her legislation. There's no question, it's an objective fact that if Senator Collins' legislation becomes law, the Attorney General will have a tool that the Attorney General does not have today. It's a tool that will stop terrorists from being able to legally buy a gun. It's as simple as that. That's what it does. And importantly to me and many of my colleagues, it also provides the mechanisms whereby an innocent law-abiding American who's wrongly put on, say, a no-fly list will be able to clear his or her name. I think that's very, very important. So The starting point is for the Collins legislation is that if you're on the no-fly list, then you don't get to buy a gun. Now let's think about this. If we deem a person to be so dangerous that we deny them the opportunity to board a commercial plane, should we really allow that person to walk down the street, walk into a firearm dealer and buy an AR-15? I don't think that makes sense. I think most of us probably agree. So that's a short list, actually, of people that we deem to be so dangerous that we don't let them board a plane, but pretty sensible, from my point of view, to also preclude a firearms purchase. And then we have the selectee list. That's a separate list that subjects people to enhanced scrutiny because there's serious suspicion. It doesn't quite rise to the level of the no-fly list, but there's serious suspicion. So those people also would be denied a firearm. Now, as with the approach that I took, Senator Collins' legislation has a whole series of procedures and policies and mechanisms to ensure that if someone is wrongly put on this list, they'll have a way to get off the list. And what we know for a fact that eventually some people will be put wrongly on the list because people make mistakes, governments make mistakes. And in fact, someone could even try to abuse the list. And so we need to have a mechanism to make sure that an innocent person can have their name taken off. Senator Collins, I think, achieves that. She creates an adversarial challenge mechanism in court where the burden of proof is on the federal government to prove that the individual who's been denied the opportunity to buy a gun should be denied that. In other words, the person is properly on the list. And as in my legislation, if the individual succeeds in his challenge, if he says, I was denied the opportunity to buy this firearm, I'm not the John Smith that you think I am, and here's my proof, and the person wins, why the U.S. government would pay all of his reasonable attorney's fees and costs, as it should be the case. The person shouldn't be financially penalized for simply clearing his or her own name. Also, there needs to be a meaningful deadline for a court to make a decision. In the case of the Collins legislation, it's 14 days. Otherwise, of course, a court case could go on indefinitely. That wouldn't be right either. So, Madam President, the bottom line is simple. This legislation is a sensible, reasonable way to achieve the balance that I've been calling for. Make it illegal for a suspected terrorist, someone we won't allow to board a plane, to buy a gun, and at the same time create a mechanism for someone wrongly put on the list to clear their name. So last week we had quite a number of our colleagues were down here on the Senate floor. As I said, they were giving impassioned speeches about how essential it was that we do something. What we're going to find out is whether that was sincere or whether that was political. That's what we're going to find out. Because this legislation achieves exactly what our colleagues said they wanted. It may not do it in exactly the fashion in every little detail. It is not exactly the same as the legislation that I had proposed, but it's bipartisan. There are, at last count, at least 5 members of the Democratic caucus who are on this bill. There's at least a comparable number of Republicans. There's probably more that are going to support this. And it's really going to be a test of whether this body is serious about what it says it's serious about. Whether the folks who came down here and gave impassioned speeches about how important it is we do something, do they really want to get something done, or do they want a political message to run ads about? I hope it's the former. I hope we're going to be able to get something done, because Senator Collins and the other senators she worked with, and I appreciate the input she took from me and my office, to craft a sensible, workable, compromise bill that has bipartisan support that will achieve those 2 important goals of making sure that the bad guys can't buy guns and the good guys get a chance to clear their name and don't have their Second Amendment rights infringed. That's what this is about. We need to have a vote on this. We need to have a vote soon. I hope we'll have a vote still this week. But this is an opportunity for this body to take a big step forward and get something done with a bipartisan compromise bill that makes a lot of sense. We're going to have a test, Madam President, and I hope this chamber will pass the test. I yield the floor.